So I'm giving this talk on behalf of the PEN team, the Poverty and Environment Network team of C4, which is a team of up to 50 external and internal people, mostly comprised of PhD students, but 10 to 12 senior resource people as well. So I am but one of those members of the team, so any shortfalls in this presentation, please refer to my other members and colleagues of that team. So essentially I'm going to give a very brief outline to what PEN is, what the Poverty and Environment Network is, and provide some quick and dirty research findings. We're in the final process of analysing our huge data set for publication in the next few months, and I'd like to present some of these preliminary findings. So PEN is essentially a very large, tropical-wide collection of detailed and high quality, we think high quality, comparable data, which is essentially collected by PhD students. And essentially looking at the poverty and environment nexus, looking at how important forest products are for rural livelihoods. And we believe that is currently the most comprehensive analysis of the poverty and forest linkages undertaken to date. Essentially, it's an approach that incorporates PhD students. PhD students tend to have a relative amount of enthusiasm, one would hope. They're engaged in long periods of field work, and as I said, they're supported from C4 by a network of senior resource persons. There are mutual benefits to this arrangement. The PhD students are able to tap into the expertise of C4 staff and also their university supervisors, but also we are able to generate huge amounts of data. Capacity building, majority of our partners are from developing countries, and a book that was published last year by Earthscan really highlighted how much we had thought about the methodology related to PEN, and we like to think that it's somewhat of a state-of-the-art, a textbook model, if you like, for how to collect livelihood data in rural settings. So PEN, the numbers, we have 25 countries which are represented by PEN. There are 40 studies, although only 38 were good enough finally for the data set to be finalized. You can see that there's over 200 households in the average study, but I'll go down further and further and further, 17 million data cells, which for our poor database manager is somewhat daunting. And one of the major problems we've had is cleaning the data and making sure that the data that we have is credible and replicable, and it's been considerably challenging. Just a quick map to show exactly where we have been undertaking our studies. There's quite a nice representative sample across all 3 continents. And essentially, the 2 hypotheses that PEN was set out to test was to look at what the significance of forest environmental income is for rural livelihoods, and to understand whether it is or not that the poor who rely on forests. And obviously many of us are aware that the open, easy access issues related to poverty and forest access are extremely important, but also the issues of lack of opportunities, and I'll touch on those in subsequent slides. So some results. I was really delighted to see how much in Chris's presentation the figures are resonating with the LLS studies. If I can, yes, here we are. So this is our global data set with all of our households included. So our contribution of forest income is just over 20%, so about 1/5, if you like, of all household income for all of the households that we sampled. There's a smaller amount of other environmental income, and this includes income such as minerals, and fodder for livestock, but we haven't included those in the global data set as yet. Looking at whether the poor or the richer members of a community are more reliant on forest products, the quintiles here represent the top 20%. These are the richest members of particular communities, and at the bottom we have the poorest. And as you can see, forest reliance is very much more predominated by the rural poor. There's some interesting intersite variation, particularly across continental levels. There's a nice grouping of the African sites here, which are very reliant on forest products, but do not receive so much income, if you like, from those particular forest products. Asia, again, a nice, heavily strong reliance on forest products, but again, limited value in terms of the actual overall income generation. But here's some interesting outliers from Latin America, and although overall forest reliance is relatively low, there are significant income generation activities, for example, Brazil nut in Peru and Bolivia and elsewhere in Latin America. So there are some nice regional differences which the data has picked up. So we've also disaggregated much of the data set to look at various aspects of other forms of poverty and environmental linkages, and particularly gender. And this is a study that I led with a team looking at essentially what is the gender differentiation in our data set. And unfortunately, many of the claims made in the literature are very much focused on case studies, and we weren't quite sure how replicable or how they could be upscaled into policy recommendations. And so we essentially took our entire data set and looked at the gender differentiation of the forestry and poverty linkages. This is one example. The general conception is that women collect forest products, or predominate in terms of the forest product collection. And in fact, globally, it's a fairly accurate assessment. W here obviously stands for women, B is both, so these are shared activities, and men here. In Latin America, actually, it's quite the opposite. Men dominate the harvest, the sale rather of subsistence, collection and sale of forest products. In Asia, it's pretty much equitable, but in Africa, women do dominate, as Chris mentioned in his presentation, that women do dominate the forest product collection process in Africa. And just to highlight, there is a large regional variation in both the shares of forest products collected by women. But one point I really want to make here is that disaggregating our data set, we've come to question some of the sort of perceived wisdoms, if you like, about the role of both genders, men and women, in the collection of forest products. And men, excuse me, do play a much more significant role in the contribution of forest products to rural livelihoods. What happens with that household income is subject to debate. We don't have consumption data, and there's some speculation as to how much that male income contributes to the household income or household economy, but that's something that we want to, I like the fact that most of the men in the audience are smiling there, but it's something that we want to test in future research. We also looked at tenure. I've just got the 3-minute warning, so I think I'm going to try and skip through this as much as possible. But basically, in terms of regional forest tenure, there are major differences between Africa and the two other continents in terms of community forests and private land. And these correlate relatively well with the RRI, who owns the world's forests study as well. There are some major findings related to that, and Pam Jagger and her team are going to be writing this up, or have written this up, and it's published in World Development in the last month or so. I'm not going to go through these in particular, but they're pretty obvious from the bullet points. And one of the final studies was looking at how rural households contribute towards deforestation, and what are the drivers of deforestation. And primarily, agricultural production is the most important, and as you can see, the others are of less significance. Interestingly, only 27% of households as part of our global survey actually do clear land. And obviously this may be highly variable across sites, and it's even more interesting is that the area of land cleared is actually very small. And this is primarily due to most households focusing on swidden agriculture, and very few of the households that we were involved in surveying were involved at all in any commercial agricultural activities. Land clearing is much more prevalent amongst land-rich households for obvious reasons, clearing significantly more land than the land is poor, again for obvious reasons. Male-headed households clear more land, younger households and households close to forests, and interesting households that have suffered shocks, whether it be climatic shocks, inter-household shocks such as death in the family, or the need to generate immediate income. So in our final conclusions, we concur with the LLS study that around 1/5 of household income is generated from forests, and that the poor do seem to be more reliant on these forest products. But failing to the policy implications, if you like, by failing to account for this contribution, does give a rather misleading picture of rural livelihoods and overestimates the incidence of poverty in many respects. Harold Engelson, who's leading a paper on this particular issue, which will be published in Rural Development as part of a special issue I'll mention again in a second, really does go into the policy implications of these particular findings. I mentioned the gender issue. Our paper really does question some of the perceived wisdom related to the role of men and women in the rural economy with regard to forest products. And we also need to think about the possible biases and perspectives on the pathways in and out of rural poverty, particularly the benefits of converting forest to cropland and the overestimation economically that may represent. I think both previous speakers have mentioned the importance of tenure and property rights, absolutely crucial for investment for rural livelihoods, and issues of access, particularly exclusion from protected areas that we found in most of our sites was a major problem. There's going to be a special issue of World Development published in the next, hopefully, 2 to 3 months, which will contain all of the data and research that I presented here. The C4 Penn website contains much of the preliminary data set and some of the data itself, so you can actually have access to some of the data cells and other data that I've presented here. Thank you very much.